those of you who don't know me, I am Josh Farr, Gallery Director here at the Vermont Center for Photography. And obviously, as most of you are aware, we're very honored to be having this exhibition of these historic prints by O Winston Link. And particularly fortunate to have the Bachmans, Mary, here in the area to be so kind as to loan them to us for the month, for the duration of the show. And doubly fortunate for us, she brings her accomplices, Thomas Garver, who came all the way the other day from Madison, Wisconsin, to come up and visit and be here to see this show and support the cause, and we're very thankful to him for being here. So, with that said, I'm going to let him do a little bit of his own introduction, but I just wanted to note that both Mary and Tom were former assistants for Winston Link, and so we have this very unique local connection to this work, which was exhibited in Brattleboro at the museum in 2008. Some of you might remember seeing it, same collection of work. So it's been around town a few times, but we're lucky to have it in here for the first time. Tom is one of the last, if not the last, remaining individuals who had a significant effect and impact on this body of work that you see in front of you, both the creation of and the later business agent end of things. So we're really honored to have him here, and I'll let Tom introduce himself. So please help me welcome Thomas Garver.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. And I would want you to introduce yourselves to Mary Bachman. Mary is very self-effacing, but for 7 years she served as Winston's assistant and printer, and in fact was essentially Winston's straight man, because Winston had to have an audience. And so Mary worked in his darkroom and would commute from Putney to Westchester County, New York, and would stay down there. And of course, the Bachman Sproats then also lived in Soho. But Mary spent, I would say, as much time with Winston, listening to his jokes, telling him when to turn it off, and keeping him generally in line for the last 7 years of his life. So there's a little label back there, and I urge you to read it. It's one that I wrote, which is a recognition and appreciation for Mary. Now, I asked Josh to give my own introduction because it's short and because parts of my background in history tie so closely with Winston Link. I graduated from Haverford College, located in a Philadelphia suburb, in 1956. And that's important because that was how I would eventually meet Winston. He had photographed there for an admissions brochure in the spring of 1952, just a few months before I started. Another student with whom I was to become friends because of our shared interest in photography assisted him on campus, and I met Winston through him. After I graduated, I spent 2 years in New York City, where I worked for Winston for about a year of that time. I then traveled to the Midwest to take a graduate degree in history of art, and subsequently worked in art museums around the country, both as a curator and director, for about 30 years, before striking out to live by my wits as an independent curator, art consultant, and writer. I've written a lot of art exhibition catalogs, a number of articles on artistic and technical subjects, and a couple of books, one of them on Winston Link. From early 1994, I was also Winston's agent, as you heard, handling many of his business affairs, including the sale of his photos. And it was at this time, of course, that Mary Bachman also came into Winston's life as his assistant and printer of his photos, working in his darkroom at his home in Westchester. Following Winston's death in 2001, I became the organizing curator of the O Winston Link Museum, which opened in the old Norfolk and Western Railway Station in Roanoke, Virginia, in January 2004. It is the only museum in the country devoted to photographs of a single artist, and I will hope to show you why that may be. And Josh, I'm told Ansel Adams has a museum, but it's not a museum. There's the Ansel Adams Center, but it's not a museum. That's what I'm told. You would know better than I would. But anyway, back to New York. In 1957, I was an intern studying art restoration at the Brooklyn Museum. I needed extra money, and Winston hired me as a part-time assistant for $1.50 an hour. I worked for him for about a year, from late summer 1957 to the end of August 1958. During this time, I made 3 trips with him to assist on this massive project of documenting the Norfolk and Western Railway, the last major railroad in America to operate exclusively with steam power, and we worked in Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina. Now, one of these trips was specifically to make tape recordings for Winston's growing series of vinyl recordings, which he called The Sounds of Steam Railroading. And of course, I regarded myself as the worthy assistant, as you can see here. But there were certainly times when this is the way Winston saw my efforts. Still, I can tell you that these trips, taken as a whole, became one of the best experiences of my life, and that's now more than 60 years ago. And right here, we are traveling behind J-Class 611, the only one of these magnificent modern steam locomotives to be preserved and still in operation. This was the day I spent 15 and a half hours in a baggage car as we went from Roanoke West to Williamson, recharged the power supply for Winston's tape recorder, got back in another baggage car, and went back to Roanoke in June of 1958. Now here's a photo of Winston made about 1994 by Mary Bachman. Now, Winston Link's photos of this project, or more specifically those taken along the railroad at night, have often been called surreal, but I hold that isn't the right description. Winston wasn't trying to create some form of internal mindscape or make something so different from everyday reality, but rather he was working in a photographic tradition that is so profoundly different from the one we now regard for and have regarded for decades, as dominating our perception of photography. Winston worked in the tradition of American advertising photography of the 1930s and 1940s, and which continued into the 1950s before it really began to change. This was a highly structured, deliberately instructive sort of photography. It was created with a static, carefully placed camera, and people and things were also as carefully organized as possible. Now, it's exactly opposite of this fluid sort of photography, largely practiced since the 50s, and certainly given a tremendous boost, quantitatively at least, if not qualitatively, by the advent of the smartphone. So think of what you will see here as being the images Winston Link created for a self-generated advertising campaign promoting, as I've called it, the steam locomotive and the good life in America. Now, for this biggest project of his career, Winston wasn't working for anyone else. He was his own client and his own art director, but Winston took pictures of this steam railroad in exactly the same way as he worked making pictures for his other clients. And this is an extremely important point, and it's the reason that his railroad photos are so appealing that a museum has been created of this work. I think you'll see that many of Winston's photos are less rail fan than they are rail advertisement. So keep this point in mind as we look at his work. But first, though, I'd like to take a look at, just in a single photograph, at the photographic style that has dominated and controlled the medium for so long, a style that is so very different from Winston's own. This is the tradition. The aesthetic is marked by the use of the small handheld camera, or increasingly, of course, by the cell phone. The one you have in your pocket or purse at this very moment. It's recognized by how the photographer works quietly, almost invisibly, never touching or altering the environment. This style came to be known as street photography, as the photographers so often worked in public places and passed by so quietly. The entire genre was given a tremendous push by the publication of Robert Frank's book, The Americans, in 1959. Swiss-born, Frank came to America to start his project documenting America in 1955, the same year that Winston started his railway documentation. And this is one of the images from the Americans, and a favorite of mine. Frank was the ultimate street photographer, and it is this photographic style, seen in countless photo essays, news photographs, and now all those cell phone photos, that continues to dominate our impressions of what constitutes photographic truth. The photographer seemingly just sees, records, and moves on, but doesn't touch or rearrange the scene. So let's look at another style, one which dominated print advertising from the 1930s to the 1950s. This is the style and tradition in which Winston Link practiced, and these principles which he applied to the monumental project of documenting the N&W Railway. Now, what should advertising photography do? It surely worked to make the products and ideas photographed more real on the printed page and what I'd call more human in their perception. Winston worked within this style to make the limited photos he could make of the railroad more real by intensifying the railroad experience. He worked to take these images and carefully combined interesting human activities with the mechanics of the railroad. Now, there were three visual qualities that marked advertising of the time, and I'll illustrate with ads that do not use Winston Link's photos. The first quality is that ads were intensely instructive. In this 1952 ad for the Crosley refrigerator, you're told everything about how it operates, how it melts the ice off the coils while you sleep, how much food it holds. Everything you needed to know about the refrigerator. Ads at the time were also highly narrative and often used this multi-picture storyboard form. This is an ad style, of course, that the moving images of television has replaced. Advertising also used photography in innovative ways. And here the Playtex girdle folks are mimicking the stroboscopic stop-motion photos popular at the time to show how comfortable their girdles were. I guess girdles have actually disappeared. I mean, this is sort of a little surreal. Thus, if you were a commercial and advertising photographer, you worked to make your photos descriptive, narrative, and hopefully possessed of some clever or dramatic twist, all of which were used to attach human life and vitality to inanimate objects. It is in this tradition in which Winston Link practiced and which he refined to such a high order in the N&W project. Now, the large photo in this 1952 ad for the American Petroleum Institute is by Winston Link. So note that the ad says a lot with photos and drawings. So it's instructive, all right, and it narrates a story as well. And the photo is clever in that it invests a sense of human portent and drama in a really banal subject, working on an automobile engine. So the low camera angle, the darkness, and the strong cross-lighting all add to the drama. Believe me, you will see this technique again. Now here's another Link photo that Winston made for the API, this one more technically challenging. The plane was traveling at about 150 miles an hour at this moment, and Winston had to track the plane with his camera and balance the light and shutter speed to the point where the plane would be stopped, but the flame from the afterburner would still show. This is an image that certainly prefigured the railroad photos that were to come. Now I hit the button, there we go. Now let me show you some photos illustrating how Winston developed his style, and then we'll look at how he used it in the Great Railway Project. Now this photo, which Winston made as an undergraduate, is unimportant in itself, but it documents an experience that was to change his life. Now just to tell you a bit about Winston, he was born in 1914 and he was raised in Brooklyn, the second child of three, older sister, younger brother, of a teacher in the New York public schools, and he was a smart kid and a bright and good student in high school. His father introduced him to photography, which he liked, but he really went to the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, now part of NYU, to study civil engineering. He was a very popular student at Brooklyn Poly, and it was the only place where he ever used his first name, Ogle. And I might add that this will tell you something about the family. His mother wanted to use the names Ogle and Winston, which are two proud names from her family in naming this new baby. And Winston's father apparently said, fine, as long as they're put together to spell owl. And so that gives you a little image of the family, or maybe at least the father. But he was popular. He was president of his class all 4 years. He was a photographer on the student newspaper, and in his senior year, he was the photo editor. And in the spring of his senior year, the school newspaper did an article on the leading stripper at Brooklyn's Star Burlesque. And so you see this amazingly well-attired undergraduate interviewing that woman. And so shortly thereafter, the newspaper had an annual spring banquet. And Winston was a fabulous mimic, as Mary would tell you, and loved to do sort of these voice imitations and so on. And Winston, as a result, even as an undergraduate, he was known for this, and he was asked to supply a little bit of the after-dinner entertainment. And so what he did was to create an imaginary interview between this woman and Brooklyn Poly's stuffiest professor. And apparently it was brilliantly well received. And there was a person in the audience who liked it, thinking that anyone who could give such a witty talk might also be a witty photographer. And so Winston was offered a job making photographs for Carl Bayer, a leading public relations firm. And what they did, you have to understand, now I have to tell you this too, that Winston was both a good student and, in his own words, a clown. And he was much like his father also, a great storyteller. So there were no jobs then for young civil engineers in 1937, this being right in the heart of the Great Depression. And so this new job suited him perfectly, even though he had never studied photography a day in his life. Now, one of Winston's most successful early PR photos, successful in the sense that it appeared in many publications, is the pig in the bulletproof vest. And it takes a little explanation. Now, the secret behind print PR is that people, at least before the internet, social media, and fake news, were more inclined to accept as true what they read in the news sections, in the news sections of newspapers and magazines, while regarding ads in those publications as simply pushing the product. So what the PR company produced, of course, were articles documenting their clients' goods or services that were reported to be news, although I really resist calling it fake news. And what Winston was doing for the company was creating photos that accompanied those articles. Now, these were submitted for free use to newspapers and magazines all over across the country. And of course, this was advertising, and the photos had to contain both the client's subliminal, or maybe not so subliminal messages, but do it with plenty of what they used to call punch and snap. The photos had to be so clever that even jaded photo editors just couldn't resist using them. So what happened in this case was that B.F. Goodrich, the tire company, was a client of Carl Bayer's. And they had had one of their tires tested by a testing company in Pittsburgh, named oddly enough, the Pittsburgh Testing Lab. And this was sort of like a consumers union operation, but it was for corporations only. And so they would take your product and compare it against your competitors' products. And Pittsburgh Testing Lab said, Goodrich, this tire of whatever type it was, this is the best in its class. So Goodrich wanted to pitch that, but first they had to get some word out about the Pittsburgh Testing Laboratory so people would give some credibility to that. And they said, okay, we'll do some articles on that. Send Winston to Pittsburgh to photograph it. See what they do. Well, the problem was that the description of what they did was much more interesting than it was, in fact, in visual fact. So he discovered that they tested bulletproof vests, which at that time, today in the military, they're made of kind of a very heavy nylon mesh that stops the bullets. Then it was a very high tensile steel laid into the vest, sort of like overlapping shingles, so you could move in it. And so they said, well, we do test bulletproof vests. Ah, well, how do you do that? Well, we go out to a slaughterhouse and buy a half a hog, and we take a piece of this metal and we tape it on the hog and we shoot at it, and then we examine the skin to see how it held up. Well, this was not too appetizing. So Winston said, get a bulletproof vest in a big size, I guess, found a hog of the right size, and you have pig in the bulletproof vest. And so this was kind of Winston's fast thinking about how to do this. Now, Winston's most famous image from this period of about 5 years at Carl Bayer became known as, what is this woman selling? Is it makeup? Swimwear? Ice? No, it's Libby Owens Ford's new Toughlex glass above the flames, and what way better demonstrate its strength? This was very widely reproduced and is Winston's way of adding life to a dead subject, a piece of glass. So here Winston is very effectively demonstrated in a single image that Toughlex glass can take heat, cold, and extreme weight. But the first thing you see, of course, is the young woman doing something very odd, insouciantly adjusting her hair, while there's a fire under what she's standing on. And so that's what draws you in. So you can imagine how uninteresting this photo would be, even with the fire and the ice and all that, without the woman. Now, in 1942, with the entry of the U.S. into World War II, Winston Link left Carl Bayer. He trained himself in photography, and he'd also developed his people-centered sensibilities, that people could animate and vivify just about any scene and bring life to objects too. Winston may have declared himself a clown, but he was also a good director and loved to create photographic dramas. Now, Winston had suffered a childhood illness that left him almost deaf in one ear, so he was ineligible for military service. Instead, he served during the war as a researcher photographer attached to a secret military project run through Columbia University. The group was developing a device for detecting enemy submarines that were under the ocean's surface from planes flying overhead. And what Winston did there helped him refine his technical skills to a very high degree. But perhaps the most important fact about the lab, at least for Winston, which was located in Mineola, Long Island, was that it backed onto the tracks of the Long Island Railway, which was steam-powered at that point. The frequently passing trains reactivated his interest in railroading, and specifically steam railroading, which he'd enjoyed since childhood. He began to photograph the trains, strictly prohibited during wartime, and here is one of those images, photographed from under an overpass so he wouldn't be spotted. Now, when the war ended, Winston was invited back to Bayer, but he decided instead to strike out on his own as an independent freelance photographer, taking photos and selling his work by day and printing in a friend's darkroom at night, often, as he once said, falling asleep between traffic lights on his way home at 3 a.m. So let's look at a few of these commercial photos he made, because they're important to show how he developed the N&W photos. So here's one of the photos he made for Haverford College's admissions brochure. Link takes a potentially banal subject, a chemistry lecture, and brings it to visual life. First, he changes the direction and the angle. But another one of Winston's great sculptural tools was cross-lighting, throwing the light into a subject from two directions and crossing the light to help give dimensionality. Another is the use of the light source aimed back towards the camera, which you're told, of course, never to do, which creates a strong specular highlights, and of course then the use of the objects close up to frame and give substance to the objects in the distance. He used a 4x5 view camera, and if you've ever used one of these large format cameras, you know that this sort of photography requires great knowledge of the camera and equally careful adjustments to it. It also demonstrates Winston's love of depth, something going on from the front to the back. And in fact, he had no greater insult for another photographer's work than to say, doesn't have any depth. Now, Winston couldn't remember what was going on in this photo, which was most probably made in the late 40s or early 50s, but it contains the elements that are found in much of his photography, and certainly of that in the railroad. First is the dramatic diagonal composition, with a strong foreground acting to draw one's eye back into the depths of the picture where the principal subject or activity is located. Second is the lighting, which frequently used that combination of sparkling highlights and dramatic backlight or cross-lighting. Here's that drama on a larger scale and is an example of how Winston solved the problem of photographing an essentially dull subject. Here they're loading a big object into a flat car, and so think about the narration and storytelling here. This is the first nuclear reactor vessel built for civilian use. It was built in the mid-1950s when people thought more positively, perhaps, about atomic power than they may today. So from a storytelling angle, this is either just a big hunk of steel or, hey, it's atomic. And so it's a really theatrical vision, and you see that set by the low angle, the space set by the placement of the guard, who also suggests the importance and high security of this event, the lighting of the mass, and then also the weight of the object, which is further suggested by these workers straining to lash it to the flat car. Winston also liked working at night for its difficulty, for its drama, and for the opportunities of controlling the light as well. And so this is a photograph he took down in Port Sulphur, Louisiana for Freeport Sulphur, one of his clients. They're loading sulfur into a barge here. Now there's another quality about Winston's work that is more philosophical than technical, but which is of equal importance to his technical skill. Winston's photographs always treat their human subjects and their work with dignity and respect. Cynicism and irony were concepts absolutely alien to his photographs. These qualities, I think, are well seen here, be it a worker on the factory floor with dirty fingernails, or in an immaculate laboratory. Another quality that I think has disappeared from much of photography, and perhaps much of modern life as well, is the respect, even awe, we once held for technology and technical achievements. It seems to move faster and faster, but we just sort of discount it. But yet, when you look at this, the impression in this photograph gives us what this man is doing is really important and worthwhile. As is most probably obvious by now, Winston was a control freak. He wanted to control as many factors as possible in his photographs. As early as his time in the wartime laboratory, he has thought about making photos of the railroad at night so as to be able to control the ambience and lighting of the scene. He famously said, "Well, I can't move the sun, and I can't even move the tracks. So the best thing he could do was to change the light to create the scene he wanted." He thought about using radio-controlled flash, but there were too many variables, so simple hardwired flash bulb systems were the rule. This is Winston's first night photo, made while on assignment in Port Sulphur, Louisiana, in 1946. The stage is now set. It is November 10th, 1954, and Winston had journeyed to Chicago to make photographs for the Ethel Corporation. Instead of going out carousing at night, he went over to the LaSalle Street station to make his second night photograph of a steam locomotive, just 10 weeks before starting of what was to be the biggest assignment of his career, an assignment he gave himself. Now the assignment, the documentation of the Norfolk and Western Railway, the last mainline railroad in America to operate exclusively with steam power, began on January 21st, 1955, and continued until March of 1960, just a few weeks before the N&W terminated all steam operations. The project was a profoundly demanding one, requiring more than 20 trips to the railroad's rights-of-way in Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina, which took approximately 9 months out of this 5-year period. Winston's marriage had ended some years before, and the railroad, its people, and the folks along the line really became his home life. During these years, he conducted his small but successful commercial practice in New York so that he could raise money to continue to shoot in Virginia. He received virtually no financial backing from any other source. In the mid-1990s, when I asked him, Winston estimated that he'd spent more than $20,000 on this task. Now, this doesn't sound like too much until you realize that this sum equates to more than $165,000 today, a huge amount for a one-man photo studio. In an increasingly obsessive effort to create an even more complete record of the railroad, Winston made sound recordings which became a series of 5 LP records, and even towards the end, shooting some 16mm film footage. There were a few color photos too, but it is the black and white images that carry the work. In the summer of 1958, 1956, after about a year of working on the project, Winston held an exhibition of some of the railroad photos he'd made to date in his studio on East 34th Street in New York City. This image shows Winston to the left and George Tom, his assistant at this time, with just some of the equipment needed for night pictures. This was the introductory image for the show, and I've left it on the screen for a while so you can see what the job entailed. The large reflectors were all custom made, and he carried about 3/4 of a mile of connecting wire in the trailer pulled behind his 1952 Buick convertible. Now here's where I forgot my laser pointer, but I called your attention. At the bottom here, you'll see there are 2 World War II surplus Navy emergency lanterns that use big dry cell batteries, and you'll see one has the lens taped with tape to create vertical lines, and the one over on the right has horizontal lines. So just remember that, because you'll see that again, very importantly, in another image. Now, all of this equipment would have been worthless had Winston not been willing to do whatever it took to get the shot, even taking risks that could and did place his life in danger. For instance, this is a spread I've taken out of the first of his books, and you can see in the lower right, Winston is crossing the Maury River in March, running fast and cold with snow melt on a 2-wire bridge, one for his hands, one for his feet. I could not have done this. And you also see above that, Winston wanted to get that big thing in the foreground, that semaphore, so he built a platform on the roof of the station so he could get that semaphore in the middle. Winston, by the way, was so precise about his work that I once asked him, "Well, Winston, did you plug the holes you made through the nails with the nails through the roof on this?" And he laughed and he said, "No, I guess I didn't." But the station is long gone, of course. So just take a look at this and you'll see some of these again, but it gives you an idea of what he had to do. Now, I think you can see that though he never practiced as a civil engineer, that training and his engineering mindset was essential to the success of the endeavor. Winston melded this seamlessly with his abilities to visualize the photograph when the reality of the scene was so profoundly different from the image he produced. And here's, and you really can see that here. So Winston was really a photo jock, someone who always wants to better his personal best, and maybe even the world's record. And I think that Winston succeeded in that. His work is so highly regarded today, and he's regarded as unique among railroad photographers, certainly. And so Winston's work is quite popular with filmmakers, and one can see why. Filmmakers create and manipulate every shot to make it look uncontrived, and they know the effort it takes to get the effect. So I'll show you a couple of examples of the difference between photos made in daylight and the same image shot at night using flash bulbs. As Winston said, he couldn't move the sun and he couldn't even move the tracks, and here's what might have been produced had he worked only in daylight. And so this is Hawksbill Creek, and you know, it's really kind of an industrial slum, frankly. There's an old warehouse over here a little off, but it really looks unattractive. A slight, and this image is right here, by the way, and you can see it after the talk. A slight lowering of the camera angle, the sculpting of the landscape with lights, and the addition of people who animate the scene now makes this one of Winston's most appealing and most highly collected photos. And here's another day versus night example. This is Ryan's Dairy Farm in Shawsville, Virginia. Shot you couldn't make today because the right-of-way there is completely grown up with trees. But you can see it's made on an overcast day, and the passing train, while clear, is really dull and lifeless. But by night, the scene is utterly transformed. And to me, this is a perfect example of Winston's photographic vision. It demonstrates the ability of certain photographers who can visualize a photograph from a scene that is so profoundly different from its photo. And when I asked Winston to tell me why he took on this project, he gave me a technical answer rather than the one about cultural preservation, which is really what I had expected. He said that he wanted to overcome the challenge of visualizing a picture at night when he could only see it by day, working and photographing in virtually total darkness and stopping or slowing the trains, sometimes moving at 60 miles per hour with synchronized flash used on a huge scale, and being able to achieve the photo with only one opportunity to do it. It was the photo jock talking, but underlying all of that was the desire to capture the steam railroad as a vanishing companion to the good life. Now this is NW13, the 13th photo Winston took along the N and W, and it's right there. And the earlier images tend to be more static, perhaps, than the later ones, as Winston began to develop his technique and get the feel of the railroad, but they are certainly no less atmospheric. Now, Winston wasn't just making nighttime photos of the railroad. Each one had to have that special punch. And unquestionably, this is an element that he learned from his public relations and advertising work. Luray Crossing is one of the best-known photos from the earlier part of his project and received professional recognition from Graflex, a camera manufacturer. And now this is Gooseneck Dam on the Moray River in Virginia, up in Shenandoah Valley. It has long since been swept away in a flood, but this was the site for one of Winston's most demanding and dramatic photos. In this daytime image, it's hard to see that there's a railroad track running along the far side of the river, and it's here just a little bit downstream off to the left of the image where Winston and his absolutely nerveless assistant, George Tom, went across the river on this two-wire bridge, and they put up another two-wire strand to haul the equipment across. And I tell you, I'm glad they did it. I could not have done this. I've thought about this a lot. I think I most probably would have gotten out in the middle of there and frozen. Just look down at that water and it would have been all over. And here's the same location, transformed by light and camera placement. Again, a powerful foreground sweeps you back into the picture to the principal subject, which is hundreds of feet away and all but hidden in the trees. It took 6 days to set this up, make only 7 photos, and then pack it all up. It could only be done at a certain time in the spring when the water was high and the leaves were the trees were still bare. And here's a variation of the Gooseneck Dam shot at the same instant from the same vantage point, but with a horizontal format. And this image is rarely seen because Winston decided he liked the vertical version better. Stanley, Virginia at 3 a.m. Was a lot different in appearance at night from the way it looked during the day, I'll tell you. To Winston's credit, he could visualize how remarkable the scene would look when, in fact, this place was really pretty dreary by day. Winston wasn't being untruthful here, but rather he put his photo vision and his advertising vision to work. He could see and visualize this image in his mind when in fact, remember, it existed only for the split second it took to make the picture. Now this is North Fork, West Virginia, and this place was a bit surreal. I assisted on this photo, which is right over here, and the valley was so narrow and the buildings now all gone, so crowded the street that the roadway on the other side of the tracks was really only about 10 feet wide. As a result, the locomotives came within 20 or 30 feet or so of the front of these buildings. Now, when Winston was setting up for this shot, he looked at it and he said, "Tom, you know, these buildings have gotten all smoked up from all this, so we need to highlight, and somebody lives in that third floor apartment, go up and ask him if we can put a flash bulb in their living room so that we'll get a little highlight." Well, it was very interesting. Remember, this is Appalachia, no television, no internet. I mean, it's still isolated, but then it was really isolated. And so, you know, I went up, and it turns out there was a doctor's office on the first floor, and the doctor lived up there. And, you know, I knocked on the door, and people were always, "What's he doing and what's going on?" And I asked if I could do this. And I soon learned that the answer, when people would say, "Well, what's this?" You know, this Buick convertible would roll in with this trailer, and these people would pile out, and all this equipment. I mean, it was, the townspeople were flummoxed. And they'd say, "Well, what's going on here?" And I soon learned the secret. I said, "Well, this is a photographer from New York City." New York City? They're all crazy up there. And I don't, for some reason, they must have seen a movie where people were lighting their cigars with $100 bills. It was just, that told them all they needed to know. They're all nuts. I don't know what he's doing down here, but Winston was so nice and so respectful of them and their railroad, which was so deeply important to them, that, you know, he won them over immediately. But as far as they were concerned, not so long ago, I mentioned this when I was in Roanoke, and somebody said, "Well, no, it's still crazy up in New York City." So anyway, that's, you know, most probably some of you are from New York City, but that's the way it is. So now I've come to call the images that are most strongly marked by his advertising sensibility Winston's program photos. And here's his most famous one. Now, what should a railroad do? It should deliver goods and maybe people safely, economically, and on schedule. And here in Hotshot Eastbound, it's doing just that. But now its function is accompanied by what so many of us may remember as a very pleasant pastime, going to the drive-in movie. Now, the drive-in in Yeager, West Virginia, was playing the movie Battle Taxi about pilots in the Korean War. And Winston's previous attempt at this photo was a failure, but he now had a new power supply, which was lighter and more powerful, and this second effort was successful. There are somewhat over 40 flash bulbs in this. The couple here is nestled in Winston's Buick convertible in the foreground, and it's one of the few times that the top was ever down, other than to load and unload the equipment. And I once asked him, I said, "Winston, why do you drive a convertible when a station wagon would be much better?" Station wagon's much too obvious. The thing is, for Winston, success was measured by a Buick convertible and a beautiful woman on his arm. And so when he got this car, you can't see it here, but when he got this car, the first thing that happened, by the way, he had to badger and cajole General Motors because this had a manual transmission when the only thing you could get on a Buick at that time was the Dynaflow transmission. So he got a manual transmission, and the first thing he did when he got it was to take out the back seat, the seat and the back, and replace them with wooden panels so he could load equipment in it. But so that was it. He had to have a Buick convertible, and it did just fine. So here's another one of the program images, and to me, this is a perfect Winston Link railroad photograph. Winston called it sometimes the electricity fails, and you can see, I know, having now been with Sproat and Bachman out there in the country in Putney, sometimes the electricity does fail. But you see here there's an electric pump, but the electricity fails, and so Here's the story implied here in the differences between the activities of youth, out for pleasure and a good time, and old age. The man is pumping the gasoline into this gravity-fed pump. And I think of course, again in Winston's convertible, which people, who are really observant say, if you're in Virginia, why does that car have a New York license plate? But we never worried about that. But the light passing through the gasoline, the little puff of steam, it's just perfect. It's a strong foreground leading back to the background of the railroad, serving well, serving that good life. And this is one of Winston's most popular and highly collected images. The Birmingham special gets the highball at Rural Retreat. And there are two versions of it behind the screen here, which it's quite an interesting comparison. Because the engine is passing us and not coming towards us, we become, in a way, the engineer and move along the tracks with it. And this movement is strongly emphasized by Winston's placement of the camera right in the middle of a subsidiary track, where nothing makes more powerful speed lines, recessive speed lines, than parallel railway tracks diminishing into the distance. Interestingly, the international recognition of this photo in later years helped to save this building, restore it, and turn it into the town's community center. Winston just can't resist adding the human touch to even his most formal geometric photos. Now this is Archie Stover, the crossing guard at Luray Crossing, the man who sat up in the little shanty in the background, lowering the crossing gates during the day when trains were made up in the yards to the right of the picture. And here's Winston and George Tom making this photo. George Tom, you see down there in the lower right, is huddled over the famous power supply. Now this is Winston's Norden bomb site, which was one of the most highly guarded secrets during World War II. And we guarded it just about as carefully. We never got out of the car and went into a restaurant without carrying in the power supply. It was in a little kind of like a woman's makeup case, sort of about so high, but it was painted a dull red. So, it'd say, you got the red box? Yeah, fine, okay. We take it in the motel at night. Never stayed in the car overnight. And so George is checking to make sure all the connections are right as Winston makes the picture. Now on December 31st, 1957, Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Franklin Pope stood on the front porch of their home and watched the last steam-powered passenger train pass by. The role of the railroad is to move the goods, and certainly people then as well, efficiently and economically, but here Winston ties it into a moment of touching intimacy. The compositional elements here might have made a very credible photograph, maybe even a better railroad picture without the Popes. But adding them gives us the zest of humanity, and humanity in the pursuit of that good life was the principal reason for the very existence of the railroad. And here's another one of Winston's strongly programmed photographs. And it demonstrates how he continually connected the railroad to humble, symbolic, and happy acts of human activity, in this case, the ancient annual ritual of bringing in the Christmas tree. And it's been interrupted here for the moment by the passing of the train, always dramatic, and certainly so when it thunders over such a wonderful bridge. This photo also demonstrates Winston's sense of lighting something with complete artificiality, but also with complete believability. Now, I told you to remember those two signal lamps. Now, if you look right on the corner of the bridge, kind of right under the cab of the locomotive, you'll see a tiny little dot. And then in front of the pilot of the locomotive a few feet, you'll see another little dot. So imagine that's all you saw. Nothing, everything else is dark. And Winston knew that he had to place the locomotive between those two lights, which he also used to focus and check the focus of the camera at night. And so he knew he had to place the locomotive preferably nearer the one on the right to get a good shot. So then think about this. This shot existed for, 1/100th of a second, if that. And so the source of light comes from 7 different locations. That huge big reflector behind us here to the left. Another behind the house lighting the front of the locomotive. One a photo reflector set up in the middle of the road aimed backwards, suggesting that a car is passing away from us and under the bridge. Another is set up directly towards us as though a car is approaching us. Of course, we don't see that, but we don't really think about that. We simply recognize the light patterns. So there's 4. And then there's a 5th light inside the house, a 6th light on the porch, and most difficult to control, a 7th flashbulb in the kid's lantern, which is very heavily masked, so that because that would overexpose the whole thing if it was just a naked flashbulb. So Winston often used those plastic coffee cups to mask the image. So this, by the way, is J611, the only photograph Winston ever made of this wonderful locomotive, which is, as I mentioned, now preserved and in use in excursion service. Now, the steam railroad was present not only at our moments of intimacy and ritual, but it was the background for moments of high drama as well. So as the Grotto's volunteer firemen serve the community, the railroad serves the region. Now, this was an elaborately stage-managed photo, but several times when I've shown this image, folks tell me after my lecture how lucky Winston was to have been there just as the fire alarm came in. So this is a demonstration of the pervasiveness of this idea that photos are simply made, not carefully constructed. He contacted the head of the volunteer fire department months before and set it all up. As you've seen, the railroad is often quite far distant from the happy events of the foreground, and here Roy Zeider, Winston's teenage nephew, the big city kid from New York, got to put on his bathing suit and meet the girls of Welch, West Virginia, as a massive train of empty coal hoppers passes in the distance. And sometimes the railroad is not just distant, it's an all but invisible presence. Not just a means of moving goods or passengers, but a device for making life far better for the people who lived in its influence. Here's a scene of peace, plenty, and a community. The place where everyone knows and cares about everyone else. The sort of place the railroad supported, but sometimes the railroad's presence might be all but impossible to find. It's here, however, just outside the store window, seen only in the number and driving wheels of the locomotive. Now at this point, Winston, this is train number 2 to New York, which left Roanoke about 6 in the evening, so as it went up the Shenandoah Valley, it was not terribly late in the evening. And Winston had gotten to know Walter Finney, the principal engineer of the locomotive, so well that before this train left Roanoke, Winston had contacted Finney and said, "Walter, stop the train in Vesuvius and spot the locomotive just by the Austin's General Store so I can get the number on the locomotive in there." Finney said, "Yeah, sure, okay," even though you know the conductor is captain of the train, not the engineer. I think there were a few words exchanged, I gather, about his stopping there, because the only time the train really stopped there was if there was somebody to get on or to get off, and I think in this case there was not. But in a nearby town, Mr. Blackard, the local banker, labors late, comforted by the rumble of the nighttime passenger train, barely visible through the front window. And of course, what Winston loved about it was all the old stuff. And that's the reason that he photographed the banker at work. And those who've retired from the labors of a lifetime may spend a quiet, old-fashioned evening talking on the porch, accompanied by crickets and the happy thunder and whistle of the passing train. Back at the station, the railway workers, ever diligent, pursue their craft in surroundings hardly changed from what they must have been 50 years earlier. While the careful ticket agent checks the schedule from behind a cracked glass of an ancient station window held together with a wad of petrified putty. Up in the switch tower, Mr. Miller Ruth, in a shirt and tie he always wore to work because he had an inside job, manages the manual interlocking switch levers while a Seth Thomas clock looks on from the background. Here, as in all the photos Winston made of railroad workers, he honored the dignity of their labor and the pride they took in it. That included Charles Wade, an engine lubricator working in the yards of Bluefield, West Virginia. There were few African Americans working for the railroad then, but those who did had solid jobs and a decent day's pay. In the roundhouse, the steady engineer, J.R. Harrell, checks his engine, which the machinists and the ostlers have maintained so carefully. The steam locomotive was a profoundly labor-intensive machine and an equally huge one, both in size and scale. The repairs carried on inside the roundhouse were supported by a constant round of checks and adjustments made along the line. But the Norfolk and Western's Abingdon branch was a different kind of railroading, a trip back in time to machines of smaller size which meshed with the lives of the people it served in the rugged mountainous country south of Abingdon, Virginia, as it moved the 55 miles to West Jefferson, North Carolina. Fondly nicknamed the Virginia Creeper because it ran so slowly and was often so late, its first stop in the morning, 6 days a week, was Alvarado, Virginia. Today the station is gone, but the roadbed, converted to a hiking and bicycle path, exists as far as the North Carolina border. The Abingdon branch was truly an intimate part of the countryside, and folks knew that it was a vital part of their connection to the rest of the world. They even trusted the engine crew not to dirty their laundry by blowing smoke on it. Winston loved the little branch line. It was his favorite part of the railroad, and he treated it differently and more intimately, too. And waiting at the White Top Station, Virginia, the highest point east of the Mississippi, reached by a regularly scheduled passenger train, was Gladys Harriger, one of the N&W's 4 women station agents at the time. And in the long wait between trains, she made quilts by kerosene light. Joe Dollar was 15 years old when he happened by as Winston was setting up to photograph the creeper, and Winston told him to get into the photo to serve as that vital human element. Old Maud also just happened by as Winston was getting ready to photograph the arrival of Train 201 at Green Cove, Virginia, and her bow was a lucky accident as well. This little station had been bought from the N&W years before by the Buchanan family, which ran a grocery store and post office there. Today, alone of all the others on the line, it still survives and has been restored by the U.S. Forest Service as a refreshment stop on the Virginia Creeper Trail, which uses the old railroad bed from Abingdon to White Top, Virginia. In fact, this is most probably a bicycle path I could take, because what so many people do is they get a van in Abingdon, go up to White Top, which is 1,000 or more feet above Abingdon, and basically coast down from there. But they've maintained or rebuilt some of the bridges through beautiful country. The Buchanans lived, and I think their descendants still live in this house just in front of the station. The trees, little bridge, and flower pots are gone now, but the house remains. This, to me, is one of the most beautifully composed photographs in the entire N&W project. As the train moved slowly towards the heights of White Top, Winston Link made an image that might reasonably be compared to the work of Robert Frank or one of those street photographers. There are even some other images that have that flavor, including this image of children watching a train in Nella, North Carolina. This certainly has a street photographer flavor, and they're waiting, it's Saturday, and they're waiting for Ralph White, the conductor, to throw them their weekly suckers. And I think that it shows well the isolation and the desolation of this part of the country, which maybe has improved slightly, but it's still like that. Now, color didn't play a major part in the project, but there were times when the photo seemed to demand it, particularly during the fall on the Abingdon branch, as you see here, in a scene that is reminiscent to me of Currier and Ives. Color at night was exceptionally demanding. The film was extremely slow. If you know, today, your digital camera is rated at thousands of in the ASA ISO rating. The film used here had a rating of between 16 and 24, and it was in a very narrow range between over and under exposure. Winston attempted only 2 color photos at night, this one of the Kelowna shipyards in Norfolk early in the project, and this one very late in the project, taken on the Blue Ridge grade for a cover of one of the record albums of steam railroad sounds. Now again, I can remember Winston telling me after the record came out, well, I got a letter from someone in California, you know, his voice, the New Yorker's response to California, somebody from California saying, boy, Mr. Link, were you lucky that that switchman left that red lantern on the ledge. Winston had taken both lanterns back, they both had flash bulbs in them, and he had worked to balance and mask the flash bulbs to balance their power against the lighting of the rest of the scene. There were experimental and expressionistic images as well. This one's rarely seen, but it's right over there. Images that were more powerful in their visual energy than their precise narrative. And here's a double exposure, a test which for years Winston thought was a failure. It's a freight train. He made one of a freight and one of a passenger train, but he was trying to get the lights of a huge power plant in the distance, and he did not realize that how much, when he fired the flash, how much the existing light would kind of penetrate through the body of the locomotive. And here's a photograph that Winston set up and shot so rapidly that it was not perfectly focused, making it, to me, all the more dramatic. Now, near the end, very near the end of the project, Winston made a startling pair of images of the same locomotive at the same instant. The first recorded is a Class A engine moving fast downgrade with a load of empty coal hoppers, while the second camera, set closer to the track, used a shutter speed slow enough to only partially stop the engine's motion as it thundered by. This is the closest visual embodiment I've seen of the experience of one of these great engines at speed. One could hear it coming from a great distance and get ready for it, but when it passed, it was an instantaneous explosion of frantic but controlled energy. Then it was gone, and steam on the Norfolk and Western Railway was gone, and Winston Link returned to New York to document another great engineering achievement, the construction of the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge. So here, the SS United States, America's, the world's last great high-speed passenger ship, passes under the unfinished bridge as she enters New York Harbor at dawn on an August morning in 1963. So let this image stand for that project and for a time gone by. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any. Yes.
I have always wondered in the movie theater, or the drive-in movie, the airplane, is luck?
No, nothing was luck. This, and Mary can certainly attest to this, this photograph is the result of 2 exposures. Winston made about half a dozen exposures in the dark of images on the screen. So the negatives are otherwise clear except for these little images. Plain, I think there's a couple other things. And in the very first images that he made of this, he printed the body of the photograph and the planes separately and collaged them together, glued them on top. Then he tried to develop a system of taking and printing them with 2 enlargers and masking them. So one enlarger would have the body of the image, and the plane would be masked off, and then he would take that into another enlarger, which everything else would be masked off but the plane. And they're very rare. And finally, he succumbed to making a very good print, combined print that way, and creating a good copy negative. So basically, I can tell you that Mary printed this print close to 400 times.
Oh, wow.
Because I kept track of all those records. You don't know that, Mary, but I do. And so this, like Ansel Adams' Moonrise over, what is it, Hernandez, Josh? Okay, which was printed something like 700 times. I think without question this was printed during Winston's lifetime easily more than 500 times. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't know the location, but the one that's to the left and down of the
That's Stanley, Virginia.
So I'm just curious, that was done at 3 in the morning. Did you tell everyone in the town that this was happening?
No, Stanley, Virginia at 3 in the morning is not too lively.
No.
So I think actually, Winston said it was 3. I suspect, and from what I've heard, it was earlier. But I will tell you, there is a figure in there. There's a figure of a policeman. And actually what happened, you see the phone booth right there in the extreme right. But this is before cell phones, of course. But Winston had the phone number of the dispatcher in Roanoke. So he called them up. He first took one picture, and he called them up, and he said, "When is the next train through?" And it was due through fairly soon. And the dispatcher said, "I'll slow it down for you." And so Winston changed all the flash bulbs as quickly as and he finally called the dispatcher again and said, "When is the train coming?" And he said, "The train is moving very slowly. The fireman has gotten off and is walking up to see you." And so they were in communication somehow. I think they also used perhaps the engineer and fireman used two-way radios at that point. But Winston's reflectors, where's the picture behind there? Winston had found a reflector where you didn't have to screw the flash bulb in. You could just yank it out and jam it in, so that you saved like a couple of seconds on each bulb, and that big one held 18 flash bulbs. Yes?
All of the crew on the trains were aware that the picture was going to be taken?
Yes.
Because I just can't imagine the explosion of light.
Well, I'm sure that early on it must really have startled them. And there's another one. I guess I'm looking. Mary, do you have? There's one of them. There's an interesting. Mary has half of it. You see the Ryan farm with the silo, and right there, Josh's head is actually in front of it. That one. Winston, in sort of one of those jockish. I mentioned the photo jock. In one of those jockish things like, okay, I'm going to make a triple axle here instead of a double, Yeah. He used 2 cameras, and he photographed both sides of this scene at once without ever seeing the flash bulbs from either direction. And so this was kind of a brilliant effect. It didn't mean much, but it was just kind of a dazzling, one of those things, like an extra flip in a ballet or figure skating or whatever. And so that but that's one of those, and so it must have been quite something as they went through, and there were flash bulbs on both sides of the locomotive. And yes, people, I guess pretty soon it's like, oh, Link is out again. I see that just, and the dispatcher, usually Winston would call in and tell the dispatchers, okay, I'm working in Welch tonight and I'll be working down around the swimming pool, something like that. Okay, thank you, Mr. Link. We'll get word to the engine crew. And the railroad did not, in fact, they produced a little volume, I don't think Mary has it back there in the case, called Night Trick. But they were sort of torn by this. They produced it in 1956, a little documentary piece on the night, they work while you sleep. But the problem was the railroad knew they were going to be changing sooner rather than later to diesel, so they didn't want to emphasize all that. But of course they built their own locomotives and they owned the coal mines. The railroad owned, they leased them out to operators, but the railroad owned a lot of the Pocahontas coal field. And so obviously they had a good price on the coal and they built the locomotives. But finally, suppliers stopped making the parts. And they also were extremely labor intensive compared to, it's like starting your car or keeping your horses in the barn, in terms of maintenance. But that was a shot, but they all knew Winston. The railroad on this night trick book, Winston said, okay, I have to charge you $50 a photograph. And they said, well, gee, we've never paid more than $25. We'll check. They had to go all the way to the president to get him to approve, you know, maybe there are 30 photographs in the book, to get him to approve that extra, you know, few $100s of expense. But other than that, they were incredibly supportive. They switched trains from one track to another. They added cars. That car that you saw me lying in on the mail, they added a car, an extra baggage and mail car for us. And so they would send people along if they were a little concerned about where we're going to fall off or, you know, get in trouble. They would send somebody along just to keep an eye on us. And of course, this was a time, you know, when you didn't worry about litigating and you were going to sue over this or there was going to be an uproar, you know. Yeah, okay, fine, basically. Oh yeah, okay, just sign here, you know. Yeah, I see you've had experience working. You know, that's what Winston said. I've worked around a lot of factories. I know what to do. Oh yeah, we can see that, Mr. Link, fine. You know, and so it was another era, I'll tell you. Yeah.
One last question.
Yes.
The ones that you say are not unlike Robert Frank, the more
Right.
street photography, did Link respect people like Frank, or did he view it as...
Well, it's very interesting that when I wrote the introduction for the second book, I talked about this comparison, and Winston was annoyed that I talked about Robert Frank too much, so I had to no. Winston, basically, there were a few photographers that he respected, but by and large, and I think Mary would, Mary, you can attest to this or not, generally he poo-pooed other photographers. And you'd say, Winston, who influenced you? I don't know, you know, I learned from people and people learn from me. And in fact, he knew that I was involved in the arts and was interested in contemporary art, and this is when abstract expressionism, Pollock and de Kooning and those big names like that were at work. And Winston, oh God, what is that stuff? And he loved Currier knives, and he collected Currier knives. And you know, until Winston became an art photographer, until this changed his career, he was a little suspect of museums and so on. Of course, once he became collected, that his work became, you know, he used to sell prints a little smaller than this for 25 bucks until, you know, the dealers took over and stepped in, and he became a hot commodity at a couple thousand and all that. And so that changed his tune. But until then, he was a little suspicious about the art market and the art world and all that. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.